Hi, welcome. I'm Sarah Smuts-Kennedy. I'm the vision holder for the Love of Bees, Regenerate Now, and one of the co-founders of the Urban Farmers Alliance. We're really thrilled to be here on the 14th Farmer in the Field with Jackie, and here in Auckland at her project. So this is a domestic scale project, and I'm really excited to be able to really be in your space today, Jackie. It's very exciting to have so many people using the UFA resource and Regenerate Now to upskill their capacity in regards to using their photosynthesis opportunity to mitigate climate change, develop food security, and in some instances, create local job security as well. We now have over 110 people using the WhatsApp channel on a daily basis and learning with us, and it's our intention to be useful to our community, and so Jackie hopefully will be useful to you today. Daniel.
Hey, good afternoon everyone. Yeah, really great to be back in Auckland again to visit this project here. I spend a lot of time, or most of my time, advising growers from one end of the country to the other in all sorts of different scales, from avocados to kiwi fruit to pastoral systems, and obviously urban farms. And it's always challenging, you know, in the more condensed spaces, to see just how much we can actually get and produce out of it. So Jackie, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your project and tell us about what we're going to be looking at this afternoon.
Hi, my name's Jackie. I live in a urban property in Mount Eden. We have about 1,200 square meters here, so it's relatively large, but not all of it is available for actual growing, but I do have some more potential than what I'm currently using. So really what I'm looking for today is just some advice about how to use the spare land I've got in a more productive way, and where to locate various things like the chicken coop and the compost. And I can, yeah, explain a few things as I show you around. So I'll do that now, shall I?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Thanks, Jackie.
Okay. All right.
Sounds like your chickens want to introduce themselves.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll just give you an overview from here. This is the area that used to have a trampoline on it. And then we built the chicken coop, and we've got a little bit of space that I'm using for growing. I'll take you closer, but just while we're up here, you can see that there are two areas where there's quite a bit of star jasmine growing on banks along here, which is beyond what you can see. It's very steep, especially on that side. But I'm wondering if we could do some terracing potentially, just to make more use of that. So our boundary is where those dead pittosporums are. But I will take you around this way so you can see what else we've got. This is up at the house. We've got a deck up here where I've planted just some ornamentals and some herbs, so that's really handy for my zone A, being near the house and able to come and get the parsley for cooking and things like that. So that's the sort of house garden, if you like. Then there's a relatively large lawn. We have a dog. We've got plum trees that, you know, normally have blossom, or in the spring they're very pretty. And then coming down here, we have a pathway that goes down to an area that used to be our compost, where that building paper is. Oops, there's an old bin, compost bin just in there. This is where our chicken coop used to be. But this area, as you can see, is quite dark. There's a macadamia nut tree in the middle, and then these trees are all feijoas, but they haven't done particularly well with the drought, and they need a really good prune. And then continuing on down, we get to these banks. I don't know if you have any appreciation of that steepness, but I'll show you further. So we're just approaching that vegetable area, lemon tree, and yeah, you can see how steep that is now. And over here. And then this is our flat area. And over here I've got some compost growing, but it is all going down into another steep bank where there are privet trees growing up, holding the bank up. So that's kind of an overview, probably quite hard to appreciate from the view that I'm giving you, but you can ask me questions. And yeah, I think
so when you're talking about zone 1, I'm presuming that you have done a permaculture design course, is that right? Or
yeah,
you've been reading?
I'm in the process of doing one, actually, with Lucy and Georgia and various other people that are in your program or your WhatsApp program.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And so obviously you have approached us to who and you know that our interest is in urban farming. So
yes,
I'm really keen to know from you, what is your vision in regards to production? Because that's obviously the thing that we're really focused on is, you know, maximum production per square metre in sites. So is it your intention just to be growing for yourself, or do you have a vision beyond that?
Look, if I can manage to grow more than what I need and either donate or get someone else to put that into their what do you call it, your harvest boxes, then that's totally fine. And I've been to see Levi quite a few times, and I've approached him about that and said, look, if you need areas where you want to grow potatoes or kumara or, you know, things that can just be sort of left alone, or corn where you need a bit more room, or, you know, I'd be perfectly happy to offer up some of my garden for that. Absolutely. But yeah, so I'm happy to join in with something like that. I do, you know, as you can see, I need some help. You know, it's a lot of manpower needed to get things like that set up. And I obviously have, you know, I'm a great interest, but not a huge amount of knowledge yet. I'm still learning all those things as I go along. So yeah, definitely interested in getting involved in that. Not for any commercial reason, but if someone can use this land to grow more food for others, then that'd be great. I'd be very happy to be involved in that.
Okay. Just sort of thinking through the various different aspects of looking at productivity on the site, and clearly it lends itself hugely to terracing, and I don't mean terracing in the terms of cutting away into a hillside to create a flat area, but I don't know if you've seen OMG recently, what we've done at the top of OMG, which is using a very simple method to create a retaining wall. Yeah,
with the pallets.
Yeah, so that's one way of achieving that in a very simple way. Obviously, it's all site specific and what you're actually wanting to do there. But that is basically building up to create the level rather than going down, which might be done, you know, sometimes in an alternative way. By going up to create those terraces and backfilling that largely with, mostly that's backfilled pretty much with compost. But so there's a little bit less weight in it, and it's not like backfilling, you know, a retaining wall with clay and other sort of heavy materials. But that allows you to plant the front of the retaining wall as well as the garden at the top. But essentially what it gives you is the same effect as you would if you had raised beds all over a flat area, because the retaining wall allows you to work standing at the wall to work in the garden in front of you. And it's just a matter of taking that kind of approach. It's certainly one way to maximize the really challenging areas, particularly where they're quite steep, which is what we had to do at the top end of OMG to utilise sort of every last area. And it's quite surprising how much extra growing space that we've created in an area that wasn't seen as productive at all. On that site, it was the last area to look at any sort of productivity. So there's obviously that aspect to look at it. And as far as, so that really depends on how far you want to take that. If you keep them all down to no more than about 600 mils high as a maximum height for those little retaining walls, then they don't tend to create too many challenges as far as that goes. So you can start at the top of the slope and work your way down that if that's sort of the sort of thing that you want to do.
And you just waratahs or something to
well, they were, yeah. So what they did is, if you look, actually, the best thing, yeah, like the waratahs behind you, they, if you look online, where we originally saw the first idea, they actually slid the pellets over the waratahs. But the guy that put it in, that helped Levi doing it, he's actually a structural engineer student. They determined that the waratahs were better in front of the pellet, so the pellet leant up against it, because he said if you slid the pellet down over the waratah and the soil came up against it, all that was left was a board on the back of the pellet that had nails in it, and it wasn't as strong as how they've done it. So they put the waratahs in and put the pellet in front, like, you know, so they've got the waratah, the pellet, then the soil. But yeah, what we saw online was very quickly, they showed you sliding the pellet over the waratahs, but I could see very easily how they said that actually wasn't anywhere near as strong as what they've done. So it was really, it's quite an interesting exercise to go and learn from what they've done there. And they used some quite long waratahs and pounded them in basically to determine the height of the pellet. And yeah, it's really simple, very, very effective. And the great thing about it is the pellet then creates, as I said, a wall that actually can be filled with compost, and you can actually plant in the wall itself. So it's not like a solid retaining wall typically, which would have no ability to plant the front side of it.
Or to let drainage out.
Yeah, it also lets water through it. And I said with compost in behind it, that holds a huge amount of air, so it has a lot of volume. It's not like if you backfill it with clay, that can have a lot of weight to it. You know, if it's topsoil or clay, we just want to backfill that with compost, and that sort of, yeah, it just works nicely, and it's simple. It's easy to move, it's easy to fill. There's not so much weight in it when you actually bring it into that space. You can produce, obviously, a fair bit of compost on site there, and gradually do that as you go through the process. You can actually make the compost and then build a retaining wall. If you're not wanting, obviously, bring compost into the site is another way of doing it.
Well, okay, so moving on to compost.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit unclear, just very basically to start with, about whether you want your compost to be wet or dry. So in here, in this funny little spot, I have got a sack underneath. You know, there's a gap there between the sack and the, which is letting rain in. Over here, I have got a bit of clippings and things under carpet.
Yeah. And
the carpet is not totally waterproof, but pretty waterproof. So I don't know whether I'm supposed to be letting things breathe or keep them dry or...
Okay. So, I mean, there are, in the circumstance you've got there, what you're looking for from a compost situation is that the material, if you're looking for a moisture level, when you grab the composting material, you should always be able to sort of squeeze a little bit of water out of it. It doesn't want to be too dry.
That's when you've composted it.
No, that's as you're composting it. So in the process of composting, if it dries out too much, the microbial system will stall, particularly if you're using aerobic composting, which what you're trying to do there is those organisms breathe.
Okay, well, in my situation, I'm putting a lot of food scraps in.
Yeah.
And I never have any problems with it being too dry.
Yeah. Okay.
Too wet
Yeah.
is probably my problem.
Yeah, I mean, potentially the biggest improvement that you could make, my gut says, is potentially to look at something like a more formalized sort of structure in a garden like that where space is so critical, and potentially also from an aesthetic point of view as well.
Yes, quite.
If you can go with, if you look at the, what do they call themselves now, Sarah? They were NZ
The carbon composts.
The carbon compost, you know, so what was being sold as the NZ box, that's what's OMG essentially, right?
But
So
they're massive.
what's that?
They're very big, aren't they? For me, this site.
Well, yes and no, because if you've got a lot of vegetation that I can see there during the process, that you've got pruning, you've got prunings that you need to process. You've got everything from you know, there's a lot of vegetation as you produce your garden, as you start producing garden beds, and you've got all those prunings. All of that stuff could all go into that composting box. Yeah, I mean, ideally you could use a smaller composting system, but I think to have it in a retained and a bit more controlled environment, in a controlled way, particularly when using food scraps, there is a lot of benefit to actually having it in some form of composting container system.
Yeah.
You know?
The other thing is that you know, at the scale. So there's two of us in our household, and I grow about 98% of our vegetables. And I would say very similar. I don't grow, currently I don't grow avocados and I don't grow bananas. And we basically just eat what we grow, and I try and stop my husband from buying things and bringing them home. But we produce enough biomass to more than easily use one of those carbon composts. I actually tend to keep my scraps separate and then build an independent heap. You may have seen that on some of our, it's a standalone heap, but I would say for you and your circumstances, you're probably not going to be an obsessive composter like we are. You're more looking for something that is convenient. And I would say the carbon compost, one of the benefits of it, you really, in order to get the compost that you need to grow your garden, you do need to be producing more compost or buying compost in. And since you're interested in permaculture principles, I would say that you're looking at trying to become an internal system. So you're wanting not to buy compost. So the benefit of the carbon cycle is that you don't have to make it all in one hit. You can actually just add to it as you are producing biomass, whether that's carbon or nitrogen. It's going to give you a little bit more flexibility, and it's going to give you the volume that you need to be able to get a quality compost at the end of that.
So Sarah, when you say carbon, do you mean, you know, potentially having the 3-box system and you're just adding to it all the time, both your dry leaves and your wet leaves? Or,
I think all you need, at your scale, Jackie, all you would need is 1 box.
Exactly, right.
I think all you would need is 1 box. What's going to happen with your box is that by the time you get to the top, the bottom will have done its thing, so long as you're building it correctly. So it's going to be really important that you know how to put your ingredients in so that they actually don't really need to be turned. Daniel sells a product called BAM. I would highly recommend you using that, because you're going to not necessarily get the original, you know, when you build a compost in one hit, you do get a really good thermophilic, you get the heat, and then you know, that kickstarts the compost. When you're building it bit by bit, you're not necessarily going to really be utilizing that part of the process. So you actually want to have the microbes in there that can work at a lower temperature and keep processing. What are your thoughts on that, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I was going to add that you've also got chickens in there, which we can introduce into the composting system. I don't mean sticking chickens in there. I mean, obviously, chicken
putting the poods in
manure.
And
So one of the things that we used to do with chickens is we'd feed them a lot of food scraps. And so instead of putting food scraps, for argument's sake, into compost pile, we tended to put chickens or food scraps into chickens, and then you collect up you layer the bottom of their run and their house with like wood shavings. Sawdust is really good, and then every 2 or 3 months you scrape that out and you add that to essentially to the compost, to the green, because the chicken's manure is really, really rich in phosphorus. And in the small space that you've got there, what's basically happening in the floor of that run is you're ending up with an incredibly excessive amount of phosphorus in that soil. And so, in this situation, they have to pretty much be fixed. It's not really particularly probably a realistic option to move them around the garden as we might otherwise do. But what you can do is harvest that manure, and the best way of doing that, I said, is give them a bit of food scraps, because that's a good variation to their diet. Then have sawdust in the bottom, and then as that starts to break down and age, that's excellent to actually then add into the compost. And all the phosphorus in there actually will help drive that thermophilic phase, because you've got a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in chicken manure in particular. And those are the two things that really drive and can really get compost happening. So yeah, you can have a pre-composting system where your food scraps don't go into the compost, but actually go into the chicken.
Yeah, and I do put a lot of them in there, but some of them they don't. So yeah.
Yeah, so that's what you really need is something on the floor that you can actually remove. I
mean, what I've been doing is really taking out. Oh dear, I've got a low battery. I might have to go back in and recharge it. What I've been doing is removing the manure and just putting it in a bag, and then. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I have been doing that a little bit, but I've actually got it so that they poo onto this tile under the. See all that? Yeah. I scraped that up, so that's where they perch, and I scraped that up and put it in a bag, and then sort of dilute that into a water, and then put that on the compost. But you're right. Alternatively, whenever I've got lots of prunings, like lavender prunings or something, I just throw them in there, and at least then they've got something to walk around on that's not. Oh, there were Christmas trees in there for quite a while, so all the pine prunings were going in there, so they're happy with that too.
Yeah,
but I hear what you're saying.
It's more a case of helping it soak that material up. But the other thing is, of course, that you end up with like an activated sawdust. Your carbon cycle goes in. It's not just carbon or dead carbon. So if you've got that sort of material or anything like that, I mean, you can use, for that matter, cardboard shredded, any sort of carbon that can actually help soak it up, and that just help that carbon when you introduce it into the compost heap. Because when you take like pure manure in that form and dump that in, it's basically too hot. Typically if what you find, if it like a cow pat, someone described the other day, actually it was Dr. Elaine Ingham, when the cow pat drops from a cow onto the ground, quite often the concentration of that, because it's all anaerobic as well, when it hits the soil, is that quite often it'll kill the grass underneath it. And it relies on the chicken or whatever, or the bird or animals come along, dung beetle, whatever, to actually break that up and actually allow the grass to break down again. So what you've got coming out the back of a chicken, because you've got it in a concentrated space, is that, and if you collect it up in that concentrated form and you dump it into compost, look, worms will not thank you for that. If it's sort of if it's soaked into a carbon source and it's kind of diluted, and you enter that into the compost heap, then all it is lovely food. So you've got to think of it in terms of just pure manure in its raw form. Is not a natural thing to suddenly find its way into a compost process, particularly when you're talking about chicken manure in that volume. One here, one there. It's nature has that nicely designed to be spread out, but then we stick them into a cage and concentrate it all. Right? Yeah. And then we scrape that up and we dump it somewhere. Well, the problem is when we do that, we're actually dealing with something that is a bit toxic in that raw, pure, unadulterated, mass of chicken manure suddenly being dumped into places. So then you've got to be able to spread it out. That's kind of where I think, in terms of having something to soak it up with that we're mixing it with straight away. Then it's just instant food for the microbial world, rather than instant
poison.
Yeah, it becomes.
Well, it's not poison, but it's too intense.
It's too concentrate. Just think of, like someone said the other. The discussion was actually about why is animal manure toxic to the environment. We have all of this thing about the global warming effects of methane, and why are all of the runoffs into the water, and how can the purely natural thing that comes out of a cow be toxic? And the example is, well, what doesn't occur in nature are poo ponds. Nature does not collect together the manure of 1,000 cows and stick it in the space of 100 square meters. That's the sort of thing we've got to remember, is it's in the product itself, is nature will happily process it for you, but not if you put it in a purely unnatural state. So
one of the things I'm thinking for you, Jackie, so if you're looking at the bulk of looking at getting some structure that enables you to create volume in a really contained space. So the carbon cycle is an option for you there. Looking at your chickens is basically activating your carbon, like one of the issues that we have with our compost.
Adding life to carbon, yeah.
Yeah, adding life to carbon is that actually carbon breaks down at a different rate to nitrogen. And depending on what that carbon source is, it can be very, very slow. So actually having your carbon going into the chickens is actually going to speed that process up. And when the carbon hits your compost, it's actually already begun its journey. But the thing that I can think that you will need to be doing is that potentially looking at, because around your property you have a lot of clippings. A lot of that is going to be carbon, and some of it will be nitrogen. You will have a lot of leaf in there, but you might want to look at growing some biomass that is really nitrogen heavy, so that you can actually layer that into your composts in between. So you're not relying on your food scraps potentially to be your nitrogen for your carbon, for your compost, but you're actually looking at other things, and they can go on the edges of stuff. So comfrey is a really great material for that. It's got a really good diversity of minerals in it, but also things like tansy, or you will be growing, say for example, you grow broccoli. I actually grow broccoli, but most people, there's a lot of waste that comes up. So as you're growing more produce, you're actually also going to be generating more biomass. But you will need to have a look at your site and go, what are my carbon sources here that I can do every 2 or 3 months, or annually, or every 2 years? And then what are my nitrogen sources? And you may look at sort of designing, you've said you cut your lavender. That's actually, I'm not sure whether it's a good carbon to nitrogen ratio, but for my property, I've looked at designing around my property things that I can easily crop, both in the carbon space and both in the nitrogen space, so that I can actually get a really good bulk of compost made, because I actually need a lot of compost across I have a site that's probably about 400 square meters that I'm using my own compost in every year. And you've said you've got a reasonable amount of space. So that's one of the things that I would be looking at. And yeah. What are your thoughts on that, Daniel?
Well, can I just ask one more thing while we're on that?
Yeah.
Carbon is dead leaves too, right? Autumn leaves.
So what happens with some things is that, say for example, kikuya. So your grass clippings, they'll start green, nitrogen. If you leave them in a pile, and you'll notice they'll turn brown. Once you leave them in the pile and they're brown, they are primarily 100% carbon. So, well, not 100%, but in the ratio, very high carbon. So essentially you go, green is nitrogen, brown is carbon, only that isn't entirely true, because coffee grounds are very high in nitrogen and they happen to be brown. So on the WhatsApp channel, there was a very good chart, and you can find them on the internet, of carbon to nitrogen ratios of materials. And you want to be trying to get around 30 to 1. Is that correct, Daniel, in your compost as an average?
You don't want to be higher than 30 to 1. 25, so there's a tendency in many cases for there to be an excess of carbon. And you're right, leaves, when you got autumn fallen leaves in autumn, for argument's sake, when they fall brown, and hopefully we haven't lost Jackie. Oh, we're back here.
No issues.
I'll just quickly look it up. Has a carbon to ratio like 60 to 1. So, yeah. Okay, sawdust has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 325 to 1. When you get to like wood chips, you're in excess of 400 up to 600 to 1. So you can see even as sawdust in the form, even though it's wood, actually has a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio than wood chips. And you're right, from the point of view of leaves, you know, fantastic. But if you just have a pile of leaves, yes, you can create compost, but it's a pretty slow process. Food waste, I mean, it varies quite a lot. The food waste, a lot of things with food, interesting, I think people think of it as having a lot more nitrogen than it really does. What food comes with often is a lot of moisture. So as you quite rightly said early on, your compost is very, really dry because you use a lot, it's quite a bit of food waste in it. And the reason is, because the food waste comes already with so much moisture, but in itself, it quite often can actually have, like, just fruit waste as an example, 35 to 1. You know, fruit waste actually needs some green material, needs some nitrogen added to it to actually break down. And when you've got single, like if you've got a whole lot of food waste that is only one thing, and there's some food waste that doesn't work very well at all, like you've got masses of bread. We've had issues with, with people getting food waste from bakeries and putting that. Actually, the most effective way of composting things like that is through a pig. They pretty much compost it overnight, comes out as manure, and the carbon to nitrogen ratio that comes out of a pig is actually one of the lowest carbon nitrogen ratios from manure. So I think from memory it's about 5 to 1 or 6 to 1. So it becomes a lovely nitrogen source. So they can actually turn bread, which is almost impossible to compost until you soak it, and then it's sort of a mushy thing. If you've got it in excess, not that you've obviously got room for pigs, but that's also a way of utilizing how animals can be utilized within these systems. But yeah, it's really important to have a good understanding of what those carbon to nitrogen ratios of various different things are, and it's always surprising to people just how little nitrogen is actually, when we're talking 25 or 30 to 1 is our final mix. More often than not, we're actually lacking nitrogen, and we put food waste in thinking we're fixing that, but what we've actually done is add an enormous amount of moisture and not a huge amount of nitrogen.
So for example, you could, for example, grow bananas. Fantastic way to get some nitrogen, get food and get your biomass. So that's a kind of going to be a bit of a fun project for you to look at. What could I grow here that, and what we're really encouraging people to do is, we talk about cover crops, for example, to start garden beds. We encourage people to look at cover crops that are actually food. So you're not actually wasting a growing season. Not that you have an urgency to produce an enormous amount of food, but again, similarly, if you're going to be growing biomass to increase your access to nitrogen, have a look at, can that biomass be a food source for us as well? So, bananas would give you quite a lot of leaf, and there are other things. For me, I had canna lilies here. I've got artichokes, so I will harvest my artichoke leaves. Nasturtiums, somebody put up nasturtiums, fantastic. But I also eat my nasturtiums. So, and in fact, nasturtiums, great, really fantastically high in vitamin C. We feed them to our cows. You could actually start to look at, what am I feeding my chickens to enable them to be really healthy. They will love your nasturtiums as well. But really important that your chicken waste goes through a composting process. It is way too intense to go anywhere near a plant or onto the soil system without actually going through a compost first. So those two systems really important to have them functioning together.
Okay, so just one other question about the location of the compost heap. Now, at the moment, it's at the top of this very rocky bank that goes down, you know, because I know one of your videos, Sarah, you were talking about how you had your compost even in a big, like a hole, but also you were talking about how put it somewhere where anything that leaches out of the bottom of it goes onto something that, you know, would enjoy that. And at the moment, it's going down onto my privet trees, which are holding up the bank, but I don't need to, you know, fertilize my noxious trees either. So that's another thing I'm looking at, actually moving it completely. And then, as you know, you have to think about, well, how far am I going to have to barrow the stuff when it's ready to where I want to plant it, which then brings up the thought of, well, build the pile where you want to grow something, like maybe on the top of your newly terraced slope, and wait a year and then plant into it. So those are things.
If you're incredibly patient,
yeah,
that is an option. Okay. Hey, my phone's talking to me. Sorry.
So I just want to, just for anyone who's watching, who does watch this, I don't have a compost in a hole. I have a cow pit. So that is actually, no, that's okay. It's fresh cow manure mixed with various things, and that's actually creating a fermented inoculant fertilizer. But yes, absolutely. I think putting your composts on the garden beds that you want to grow in. You know, I started my garden when I was 40. I'm now 50. I intend to be here until I'm 80, hopefully longer. You know, I think and in terms of your permaculture design course, one of the things that permaculture really thinks about is energy. You know, the efficiencies of energy, and that can vary for every site and every person, and it's very fluid, it changes. So what I have done and what I continue to do is to try and design my particular property and my project to my own energy capacities, you know, what I have. So I have, for example, gravity. That's a free energy source that I work with. I have photosynthesis. I have, you know, so the rain, all of those things. How many times, where do you want to walk? How many times do you want to walk there? Where are you going to, all of those things are really things that you will continually design around. And I don't think you have to think about your compost being made in one site, but what do I want to accomplish in the next year? And how do I design to be efficient for that? So you want to start looking at increasing your garden beds. The other thing that I would encourage you to do, if you are growing for only yourself, you don't necessarily want to just be growing, like I've just had 60 broccoli come on. Now I have eaten a lot of broccoli and I've frozen. One of my things is making sure that I don't shop at all during the year as much as possible. So a lot of that's been frozen, but there are things that are slower growing, things that are annuals. So really looking at varying your diet and actually designing in and around what's coming on at different times and how you can become a lazy gardener as well, in a sense that I let a lot of things go to seed and then I transplant. So I level all of my leeks are totally self-same. I haven't sown a leek seed for 4 or 5 years. So I actually let some of those plants do the work for me. But yes, the other thing is that you really don't want to be losing that leaching. If you're on a hillside, gravity, the rain are great energy inputs that you can design around. So yeah, hope that doesn't really, we aren't on your site. You're going to have to take this information and design that yourself.
And that's where the compost was originally, at the top of the hill where I said there were all those feijoas and the macadamia nut. That's where it was, but that just wasn't close to where I was growing anything. So or where the chickens were. So I thought, well, this is, you know, not, but I understand you've got to change. That's what I want. That's what I'm really trying to address my mind to, is changing everything around to be able to grow more. And I think part of that is moving that chicken coop so that I get more flat space there. And they can be on the slope, you know,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the other thing, that they'll do a great job of scratching stuff for you too, in terms of preparing if you want to then transition those things into garden beds, you know, in a year or two. thoughts on that, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could try going for a more mobile system. It would be a little challenging, but it certainly would be possible. I'm just thinking if you're thinking in terms of, like we're talking about terracing, creating more productive space, because that doesn't want to be that wide, so it's workable in this sense. You're probably going to end up with terraces that don't want to be much deeper than maybe 60 or 70 centimeters deep. Otherwise, they become too hard to manage. And also, the wider you get, the higher the actual retaining wall part of it has to be. But if you're working in that, I was just thinking that you can actually, I mean, the warehouse actually sell a nice 220 litre square composting little thing for $50 according to this, which is only like 60 centimetres, 65 centimetres square. And you could imagine that you could create that sort of area where you are going to compost, but you literally, as you say, in that situation, you could compost in situ. The NZ box is, of course, about, I think they're 120 or 125 square. That's probably too large if you're actually trying to compost on a terraced area. It'd be fine if you're happy to move it around. But, I mean, even from the point of view of sort of the volumes that you're dealing with, having a couple of smaller composting box sort of units, and there's a range of different options, but that was one I was just trying to think of what was going to
they're currently in the process of designing a domestic scale unit. Yeah. So that is coming on stream. Yeah.
So, but yeah, the ideas you've got there are kind of right. It's just a matter of finding a place and starting. Only thing I would be wary of when you have moved your chickens, that area that you've actually got the chickens on now already has a huge amount. I don't know how long they've been there, but I can tell you it doesn't take very long for them to have a massive excess in phosphorus in that area. And the best thing you can do is actually compost on that site, right? Because that'll microbial process will it'll actually fire that up and help buffer the excess that's already exists in that area. You're right. So the last thing you want to do is if you move your chicken coop and start banging vegetables straight in the ground where they came from, because you just end up with it's a very hot little site there at the moment.
That gives you a really and also that will give you a really nice and will expand your gardens quite a bit. Which I think would be a great way for you. And, there'll be you'll be working into that no-till strategy. And that's one of the things that, this is why you need compost. But as we've discovered, you might have been watching it when we went to Kalmana and we went to Kai Cycle, they've actually used so much compost over time that actually, in fact, phosphorus is one of the issues. So when you get a phosphorus at a certain level, the fungal networks don't work. And that's really the microbial community you need to be focused on is, getting your ratio of bacteria to fungi 1-to-1. So anything that harms or, slows slows the fungal networks down, you want to be mitigating. So phosphorus, as I've learned today, is very high in your chicken manure. So that's going to be a focus of yours is actually making sure that material, when it does land in the garden bed, is rebalanced. Am I correct in saying that, Daniel, or have I gone off?
Yeah. No, you've pretty much got that the right way around.
I think mixed with stuff, doesn't it?
Yeah. I was just thinking before, as we were going down your garden there, your feed jars, which you haven't been feeding very well, obviously need a really good prune.
I know.
And you literally can't prune. I've pruned feed jar down trees that size, literally off at ground level, and watched them grow. They're just outside my office here and grow back. They're almost impossible to kill. So, but you'll find that they'll fruit and flower an awful lot better if they get a regular prune.
And it was so dry too. I think I wasn't watering them. So they should never need water on that site, to be perfectly honest. But I think they have gone beyond a practical size, and they'll cause you all sorts of shading issues, and they're just hard to pick. And so I would be very happy to you get stuck in there and prune, and never be scared to prune them too hard.
And then mulch them. So the other thing is that you can then start to mulch them, make sure that they're, but the other thing is that...
they're all around that cold compost area, Sarah.
Are they? Oh, okay.
The feed jar are around where you had the original compost area?
Yeah, it's quite dry up there. But you're right. I mean, I need to mulch them. I need to do something with all those prunings.
Well, those will be perfect to go into your chicken coop. And so that's your carbon. So that's going into your chicken coop to be basically sped up to get into your compost. So that's where your cycle is going to happen. And every year, so when to prune, there's a question, when's a good time to prune them? Now's a great time to prune them. So after something has fruited is a really good time to prune. When you've got, I'm in fact at the moment on a descending moon, so we're in a descending moon at the moment, is essentially when sap is orientated towards the ground, not in an ascending moon. I'm also going to do tree paste. So what I do is all of my trees every year get a tree paste, and what that means is I've got clay from the property that I turn into a slurry. So it's actually a reasonable amount of work to get into a slurry, but that's what I do. I might put a bit of sand in there. I might put a bit of lime in there. I have CPP, which is the biodynamic paste. If I had any 500, which is also a biodynamic paste, I put that in. Daniel, we might put some of the biologics in. Essentially, I'm making a compost to go around the first sort of 500 to a metre up the trunk. And I put a little bit of, you could put linseed oil, sometimes I use ghee, and that binds it and makes it sticky, so that it actually sticks to the tree. I find ghee to be really good, but it's quite expensive, so linseed oil is good there. And it's a paste, so it's like a poultice. And I'll give all of my fruit trees one of those every year, and it's a little bit, it's like nourishing, like composting around the base of the tree, essentially. What do you think about that, Daniel?
Yeah, no, I do get all that. I mean, the other great thing, I don't know if you guys have got a fireplace at all. Whether you have,
yeah, I've got ash. Yeah.
Okay, so ash is really, really high in potassium. It's so there's two good things you can do with it. One, if you want to save the potassium for later, you add it to your compost pile, and they'll actually, the potassium, otherwise if you put ash on the ground, the potassium leaches out of it the first rain that you get, and it goes into the soil. So that's great to put around fruit trees because they need that potassium or the potash. But if you think you've put enough around those trees, you can just put it into your compost pile. Obviously, once it's cooled down, you don't want to set your compost pile alight.
Yeah.
You know, but that's another great sort of nutrition source, because one of the things that fruit and vegetable, particularly fruit, take out more than anything is actually potassium, and so you can harvest that if you've actually got and so you may as well, it's in itself, ash is then becomes a resource rather than a waste. So it's actually rather than a waste product from your heating system, you can actually recycle that resource.
That's one of the other things I put in the paste actually is ash.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So you can put it right around your trees or your fruit trees, or you can put it into your compost.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Never let it go to waste either way. So it wants to be around fruit trees or in your compost. Right?
Okay.
Similarly with your eggshells. So if you've got your eggshells, save those. What I do is I put them into the fridge in a container until I've got as many as I can possibly fit in a container. Then I put them into the oven at 50 degrees until they're sort of basically dehydrated, and then I put them in a blender until they're a dust, and then put them into the compost, because actually that all of the calcium in that, none of it's available until it's gone through the belly of a microbe, right? So all of your minerals need to go through the belly of microbes before they're available to plants. Oh, sorry, what was that?
The poop loop.
The poop loop, yeah. So really your entire system that we've been talking about today is to creating the best poop loops, which are microbes essentially consuming your material, your nitrogen and your carbon, to actually make them available in a form that plants can utilize.
Why do you put the shells in the oven?
To dehydrate them. It makes it easier for me to turn them into a dust.
Because I just dry them, I rinse off any, white, and then I put them on the kitchen bench till they're dry, and then I just put them in a mortar and pestle. They're not powder.
Perfect.
but they're
See,
pretty small.
the finer you can get it, the quicker it'll actually enter plant availability. If you imagine an eggshell that goes out there that you don't actually break that down, you know how many years the eggshell can actually sit out there and not break down. So you actually want it you want it like dust. The finer you get it, the faster it'll actually enter the plant availability cycle. So it cannot be too fine.
So the other thing I was going to say to you is that I also spray the leaves of my fruit trees with mineral microbe mixes. Some of them I make myself, and some of them the biologics. More often at the moment, because I'm super busy, I'm using the biologics. So I'm actually using step 3 and step 4 on my fruit trees. I go around the garden, I do my vegetables, and I do my fruit trees. And so I'm, again, the same with your fruit tree. It will fruit for you when it's healthy. So you're really, and if your soil system, you're building a soil system, you want to be supporting that plant through its leaf.
Yeah. So with this BAM that I put on the compost, where do I get that from?
You can actually get it in the quantities that you need from OMG. So Levi, take down a 5-litre jar, or you can buy it from Daniel. What were you going to say, Daniel?
Oh, I'm going to say for where you are locally, you get it cheaper actually from OMG than I can, because I ship it in bulk to them and they can supply you the small quantities that you want.
Okay, from as well.
Yeah, so just get it from them, and what you do is you put it in a spray, like a little spray bottle, mix it up, leave it sitting there, and every time you add compost or something to it, just give it a quick spray. It also helps detract from any bad smells that you might get sometimes from food waste. It'll actually counteract that as well. So it's just a simple thing to do, and it just keeps that process happening.
Daniel, is there any benefit in using that in the chicken run? Like in terms of, will it...
feed it to your chickens.
Yeah, that's right.
Put it in the water.
Yes, you could actually just...
There's a couple of things. One, we used to feed our chickens a carbon source in the form of sodium-based humates. And we have a product that we put into the water system for there as well. And it was about keeping the chickens healthy. So, but yeah, it really depends. It was just particularly useful if you start getting chickens that, they're getting a bit runny. You're starting to get chickens sometimes their digestive systems aren't so healthy. Giving them a little bit of carbon into their diets quite often fixes that. So we were putting that source into the water. But yeah, the same thing, BAM, you can put that, spray it in the chicken run, spray it around the chicken run, you can put it in chicken's water. It's all help because it's about feeding, it's basically improving gut biology of those chickens.
Yeah. So we're now down to our last 2 or 3 minutes. So what is the thing, Jackie, that you haven't had a chance to ask that that you would like to hear from us? I think we've done a really great job of helping you look at potentially supporting your permaculture design course thinking. You can actually start to bring some of that into efficiencies in your garden for the outcomes that you're interested in.
Yes, thank you. Well, really just reinforcing what I said before about, if you did want to use some of this area for your productive food initiatives that you're doing to sell food, and I'd be happy to let some people use some of this area for those longer term.
I think you might have a willing partner with Levi with Jerusalem artichokes. So Jerusalem artichokes is something that actually he can sell for quite a good price. They are absolutely the dumb man's vegetable. You put them into the ground and they do not need any care whatsoever. They produce a beautiful flower. So you'll actually get this absolute rush of yellow for about a month and a half. But prior to that, you've got a lovely green. It's a wonderful perennial to have in and amongst your fruit trees potentially. And then once you you can cut them while they're still green, and use them as biomass. And if you let them go dry, they're a carbon biomass. And if you use the stems while they're green, then you're at the carbon and nitrogen. So I can see that that would be a fantastic entry point to talk to Levi.
Okay, okay, cool. All right.
I'm really happy. Yeah.
Oh. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate all the advice that you've all given me. So yeah, thank you, Sarah and Daniel. I really appreciate it.